Hello and welcome to our FODMAP chat session. In case you don't know who I am, my name is Alana Scott and I'm the founder of A Little Bit Yummy. Now today we are talking with Lyndal Collins. She is an amazing researcher from Monash University and she works within the Monash FODMAP team. Now, in case you don't know, Monash University are the lead researchers of the low FODMAP diet. So they are our go-to for FODMAP knowledge. Hello, Lyndal.
Hi, Lana. Hi, everyone.
We are so excited to have you in today's chat session. We are going to cover off 5 of the top low FODMAP diet myths, and I bet you hear these all of the time.
I'm sure I do. Yep.
You do. Now, just before we start, we know that some of you are going to have questions as we go through this chat session. Now, if you have a question as we're chatting along, please make sure you put it in the comments area below the video, and then we'll respond to you after the session with a comment or a resource or something useful for you. Right, shall we get started?
Sounds good. Let's go.
Perfect. Okay, Lyndal. So the first myth I have for you is that the low FODMAP diet is a lifetime diet.
Okay. Yeah. So this is probably one of the biggest misconceptions about the diet. And we sort of like to refer to it now more as just the FODMAP diet rather than the low FODMAP diet in some respects, partly because it has a few steps and stages, and low FODMAP is really only one of those 3 main stages. So it is what I would consider a learning diet. It's more of a temporary diet that you start for 2 to 6 weeks generally is the strict stage 1 part of the diet.
And this is where we're removing the high FODMAP foods and we're really focusing on those sort of low FODMAP foods or low FODMAP portion sizes, right?
Yes, correct. Yeah. So it's the first stage is really that low FODMAP stage, if you like, or first step, where we're focusing on the low FODMAP foods and replacing our high FODMAP foods in the diet with alternatives. So that's only 2 to 6 weeks. Then we kind of move through to stage 2 or step 2, which is reintroduction, where we start reintroducing some of those higher FODMAP foods that we previously ate to see which particular things might be triggers for us as individuals with IBS. And the third and final stage is kind of personalization. So we take what we've learnt in stage 1 and 2 or step 1 and 2, and we put it into practice in our own lives and apply it to ourselves as an individual. So this just reflects the fact that everyone with IBS will have different triggers and different amounts of certain high FODMAP foods that they tolerate or don't tolerate. So it's really about personalizing the diet going forward for you and making sure that in the end your diet is as least restrictive as possible. So we don't want to be on that restrictive diet long term. So
absolutely.
Yeah.
So essentially, it's not a lifetime diet. It's sort of a learning journey that you're going to take over a few months. And then by the end of it, you should really end up with a list of trigger foods that you might need to avoid for a while and then come back and retest later. And then a list of high FODMAP foods that you can bring back into your diet without triggering those gut-based symptoms.
Exactly. And that was a really good point there as well, Alana, in that, it's even once we get to that personalization or final step of the diet and you work out what your triggers are, those triggers might change over time. And you might find that 6 months later or a little bit longer than that, you can actually try and reintroduce some of those trigger foods again and see if your tolerance has changed. So it's a learning journey that's kind of never stops in a sense.
It's continuous. Factors are always changing. So yeah, it's about just being aware of your body, I guess.
Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so I have the next myth for you, and that is that the low FODMAP diet must be a dairy-free diet.
Yes, this is another common misconception, I guess. And the reason being is that one of the FODMAP sugars that we consider when we start the diet is lactose. And lactose is found predominantly in dairy products or dairy-based foods in the diet. So when we're on that first step of the diet and we're reducing high FODMAP foods, for some people that will include high lactose foods, which means that they're reducing dairy products in their, well, it may mean that they're reducing dairy products in their diet. However, thanks to technology, I guess, and a fantastic food supply that we have today, there are actually many dairy products that have had their lactose removed from them. Yeah.
Can
So
you give us an example of those foods? Because, for example, I adore cheese, and so I wouldn't want to have to give that up when I do the FODMAP diet.
yeah, so cheese is another, I guess, misconception in that it is a dairy containing food, but it's actually most cheeses are low in lactose because of how they've been processed or aged. So the resultant end product's actually very low in lactose, and most cheeses can be enjoyed on a low FODMAP diet. So that
just made just like so many cheese lovers out there super happy. And what about things like cow's milk? Is there a replacement or an option for that as you do the low FODMAP phase?
Yeah, so most major supermarkets, well, particularly here in Australia, and I'm sure also in New Zealand and other major countries in the world, there's lactose-free cow's milks that are readily available either in your fridge section where your normal milk is found, or in long life varieties. So they've simply had a little enzyme called lactase added to them to sort of chop up all the lactose to make it easier to digest. So we no longer have to worry about it being, I guess, acting as a FODMAP.
That is awesome to hear. I'm not sure how this is recording, but we're super sorry if Lyndal is breaking up just slightly. Hopefully she's back. I think she's back now. And don't forget that you've got the Monash University FODMAP diet app there as well. So, we've just learned you do not have to avoid dairy. Cheese is on the menu. You've got your lactose-free milk. And if you check out the app, Lyndal, I'm sure you're going to find that there's some low FODMAP safe serves for things like sour cream or cream cheese or, those products as well.
Yeah, exactly. There's a lot of dairy products that have undergone some kind of processing, which does reduce or change their lactose content. So many can actually be enjoyed, and it's just a matter of knowing that information, and you can find that readily available in the Monash FODMAP app.
Awesome. And then before we move on to the next myth, just a quick question for you. If you're in the first phase of the low FODMAP diet and maybe you're stuck out and about or you're traveling, can you take lactase tablets if you can't source those lactose-free products?
Yes, so that is something that's available in a lot of pharmacies and probably health food stores and things like that as well. So you can actually buy tablets that contain that lactase enzyme to take when you have regular lactose containing dairy products, and that will just help in your digestive tract to actually digest the lactose and prevent any symptoms that might come up from that. So it's another great tip if you're traveling or concerned that you may not have access to those normal lactose-free milks that you typically buy. It's a really good workaround.
That's good. We're all about the workarounds here and making the FODMAP diet as practical as we possibly can for everyday life. Okay, so our next myth for you is one that is super confusing for everyone. The myth is that you can't have any gluten containing foods. So these are foods that contain wheat, rye, or barley, or maybe spelt while you're in the first phase of the low FODMAP diet. So I guess, Lyndal, are we avoiding the gluten or are we avoiding something else? How does this work?
Yeah, and this is a tricky one, and it's quite understandable to see why it causes lots of confusion. Basically, what it boils down to is that a lot of your gluten-containing grains and cereals, so wheat, rye, barley, and spelt, are also high in FODMAPs, particularly fructans, one of our key FODMAP groups called fructans. So you have this sort of coexistence in those grains of both gluten, which is a protein, and fructans, which are a carbohydrate or a sugar in the simplest terms. So they kind of come together as a package most of the time, but not always. So this is where it gets a bit tricky, in that there are things that you can actually do in products made from these grains to reduce the fructans and therefore reduce the FODMAP content down, which would make them suitable when you're following the first phase of a low FODMAP diet. So things like sourdough processing is a real example, and where people will see in our app that you can actually have sourdough breads that are made from wheat or spelt grain. And the sourdough processing, what it actually does is helps to break down the fructans in that grain or flour that the bread's made from. And the result end product that you buy then is much, much lower in FODMAPs. And there are safe amounts that you can have on that first phase of the diet. So that's where it gets a bit confusing, but essentially gluten being a protein, fructans being a carbohydrate or a sugar, they can coexist, but they're not always, I guess, they're not the same. And
no, they're not the same. Cool.
Yeah, they're definitely not the same. And you can have gluten-containing low FODMAP products, and you can also have gluten-free products that are high FODMAP. So they don't always go hand in hand. And if you're just avoiding, sticking to gluten-free products because you think that they will be low FODMAP by default, that's not always the case as well. So it's it is a point of confusion. But yeah, we're not actually targeting gluten with a low FODMAP diet. We're targeting the carbohydrates or the fructans in those.
Fructans in those grains. Okay, so just to quickly summarize, you can have wheat or spelt sourdough bread because essentially the healthy culture that they make that bread with breaks down the fructan content and means that there is a safe serve for it. And then also, when you're thinking about other wheat-based products, just make sure you check the Monash University FODMAP diet app, because you'll often be surprised to find that there might be a low FODMAP serving size. For example, 2 plain biscuits, I think last time I looked in the app, is a low FODMAP serve, even if they're made from made from wheat flour. So yes, definitely a confusing one, but the myth is that you don't need to avoid these grains entirely. It's about figuring out what products you can use now and which ones you're going to test and maybe bring back in the future.
Yeah. And it's all about, just to bring that back to the low FODMAP diet, we're reducing FODMAPs in the diet. We're not cutting them out completely. It's not a no FODMAP diet. So like you said, there are some of those wheat-based products or other products similar to that will actually have low FODMAP serving sizes, even though they haven't been processed to remove the fructans. And it's simply because the amount that you're having or the serving size is small enough that it's not an issue.
Yeah. So essentially here, what I'm hearing is that portion size is key. So don't be afraid of these grains. You just need to figure out what's, a good serve to have in that first phase to reduce your FODMAP load. And then obviously you're going to test in the reintroduction phase how much you can tolerate and hopefully be able to bring some of those grains back in much larger serves.
Exactly.
Okay. So we're moving on to our 4th myth of the session out of 5. So our 4th myth is that you can cook onion and garlic in your meals and then just, remove them and eat the meal without any of that FODMAP content transferring into the dish.
Yeah, so this is a tricky one because essentially it depends on how the meal is cooked and whether or not you're cooking that onion and garlic in an oil-based kind of sauce or to start with, or something that's water-based. So I'll explain a little bit about that in more detail. So basically your FODMAP sugars, they're all soluble in water, so meaning that they can dissolve or disperse into water, but they don't dissolve into oil. So the really cool thing here is that because they won't dissolve in oil, it means that you can actually cook your onion and garlic in a little bit of oil in your frying pan or your saucepan when you start a dish, and kind of infuse the flavor of the onion and garlic into the oil. And then
so this
remove.
is why garlic infused oil is low FODMAP, right? This process.
Yes, correct.
Yeah.
Yep. So when we're infusing it into oil, because the FODMAPs can't dissolve in the oil, they can't actually leach out into the oil itself. So when you then take the pieces of onion and garlic back out of the oil before you cook the rest of your dish, you keep the flavor, but the FODMAPs haven't sort of transferred into it, if that makes sense.
Good to know.
Yeah.
We don't want any sneaky FODMAP transfers if we can help it during the first phase of the low FODMAP diet. But based on that, so it sounds like, okay, so if you're cooking in oil first, that's okay, but you couldn't just throw that onion and garlic and say like a soup and expect it to remain low FODMAP.
Exactly. Yeah. So if you were cooking a soup and you're putting your onion and garlic into a water-based kind of dish, or a dish that has water in it already, or some kind of liquid, because the FODMAPs can dissolve into the water, you do get that leaching happening from the onion and garlic into the liquid. So even then, if you removed the onion and garlic, the FODMAPs have already come out into your soup or your stew or casserole or whatever it might be. So that's where it's really important that if you're going to use them in cooking in the first phase of the diet, you do it at the beginning and only with an oil to infuse the flavor, and then remove before adding any other ingredients. Or you can use a commercially available garlic infused or onion infused oil. There's many on the market now, so that's another pro tip.
That is an amazing pro tip. Thank you so much for clearing up that myth for us and for providing some cooking advice as well, because I know a lot of people miss onion and garlic, and they'll be good to know that there is a way to infuse that flavor back into their dishes. Yeah. Okay, so we are up to the fifth myth of the day, and that is that all sugars are FODMAPs.
Yes. So the short answer to that question is no. All sugars are not FODMAPs. So I guess when we're considering the definition of what makes a sugar a FODMAP, there's a few properties that these sugars need to have in order to fit the FODMAP kind of criteria, if you like. One is that they are not well absorbed or digested in the human gut. So this can be for a couple of reasons. It might be because you have lost the ability to digest some of these sugars. Your gut might be damaged, and you don't have some of the enzymes available that normally would be there to help break down those sugars. So a good example there is lactose. Some people that experience what we refer to as sort of post-infectious IBS, where they've had a major gut infection that's triggered IBS afterwards as a result of the infection. The infection's kind of washed away all their lactase enzyme from their gut in a simple term. So it's no longer there, and it takes a while to kind of come back or regenerate. So they might have like a temporary issue digesting lactose for that reason, but it may come back as well. So it can be because your gut at the moment can't well digest a particular sugar, or it could be that sugar is not able to be digested at all by humans. And there's a couple of FODMAPs that fit into that category. So your
fructans and the GOS, I think, might be the two culprits that fall into there.
Yeah, the fructans and the GOS. And this sounds kind of alarming, because you think, well, if nobody can digest them, then why doesn't everybody have IBS symptoms? And the reason for this really is behind sensitivity within the gut. So people with IBS are known to have kind of this hypersensitivity in their gut or in the nervous system that surrounds their gut. So some normal digestive processes that might produce a bit of gas as a side effect, such as when bacteria in your gut break down those fructans and GOS because you can't, we get gas being produced as a kind of waste product, if you like. And for most people, their gut, that extra gas doesn't really bother them. It might stretch and expand their gut a little bit. They might get a bit of, flatulence or burping or whatever, but it doesn't really bother them or cause pain. Whereas in someone with IBS, their gut is quite hypersensitive to that gas production. So even a little bit of extra gas in the bowel might trigger off pain for them. And that's really what distinguishes it. Yeah.
I mean, we have millions of nerves in our gut, right? And when you have gut issues, you tune in on those symptoms, and your brain often has a really strong communication pathway with the gut. And so, it's completely understandable how that sort of cycle starts to happen.
Exactly. Yeah. There is that very strong connection between the nervous system in our gut and in our brain. So that's why people with IBS can experience the sensations of normal digestion and what might be considered normal gas production as painful or as really, interfering with their day-to-day life and activities. And there's something going on there in IBS. We're still not sure exactly what causes it or how to get to the bottom of it, but
we could probably spend like an entire FODMAP chat session talking about the brain gut axis and how amazing our bodies are about creating these communication pathways and our responses to different foods. But the question was, are all sugars FODMAPs? So just to clarify, not all sugars are FODMAPs. We've got an amazing tangent. I'm on board with this tangent, but not all sugars are FODMAPs. So it's only the fermentable ones. So we've got the excess fructose, the lactose, our oligosaccharides, which is our fructans and GOS, and then our polyols, obviously, sorbitol and mannitol, which we don't need to define. You've got the Monash app, hopefully, and you can go and learn about those. But just to clarify, you do not need to avoid things like table sugar or white sugar or icing sugar or maple syrup or rice malt syrup, which are all sort of like sweeteners that are used and could be defined as classic types of sugars used in baking, correct?
Yeah, correct. So all of those products contain sugars that are really easily digestible in our gut. So they're not considered FODMAPs. They don't have that property where they're maldigested, obviously, or fermentable either. So because they don't meet those two criteria of being poorly digested or fermentable, then they don't really cause an issue. So you don't need to avoid them. And they're all in the Monash app, those sweeteners that you mentioned. So your normal sugars. And you can find a full listing of those, and you'll see that they're rated as low FODMAP in typical amounts.
That's awesome. So definitely don't be afraid to go and make yourself a low FODMAP cake or a sweet treat or muffin to make your low FODMAP journey just that bit more interesting. You do not need to go sugar-free and make your life so much harder for yourself as well.
No.
So.
It's not a sugar-free diet. It's not gluten-free. It's not dairy-free, not sugar-free.
Free. Okay, we've cleared up a lot of food myths here. This is fantastic. Thank you so much for sharing your knowledge in this FODMAP chat session, Lyndal. You're awesome to talk to, and you have such a lovely way of explaining these FODMAP concepts for us. So thank you for joining us. And just before I wrap up the session, I'm just going to mention a few resources that might be useful to anyone listening in. Obviously, we've talked about the Monash University FODMAP Diet app. If you see on the screen at the moment, there's a little blue icon in the bottom right-hand corner, I think it is. And that is the Monash. I'm tired. It's a day. Anyway, that is the Monash University logo. Make sure you download the app that has that in it. You will pay a one-off fee for the app. That fee goes straight back into low FODMAP research. So you're basically helping the community when you purchase the app, which is awesome. And then if you need more FODMAP inspiration, want to learn more about the low FODMAP diet, then make sure you head across to the monashfodmap.com website or a littlebit.yummy.com. And these websites are both full of really good value, up-to-date information for you to explore. So that's us for this FODMAP chat session. Thank you so much for joining us, Lyndal.
Thanks for having me.
And hopefully we'll get to have you back on here sometime soon. For everyone else, thank you so much for listening in. And just remember, if you have a comment, make sure you leave it in the comment section below, and we'll try and come back and answer your questions as a comment or helpful link. Cool. Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.